The mid-90s was a wild time for gaming. Sony's PlayStation had hit the scene, redefining what home consoles could do. Among its earliest and most notorious titles released was Loaded, a top-down ultra-violent shooter that embodied the rebellious, edgy spirit of the decade. But what started as a promising new franchise, showing glimpses of boundary-pushing gameplay, soon lost its way, with its later sequel following only a year later, Reloaded, failing to capture the magic of its predecessor. So what happened? How did a potential cult hit turn into a forgotten relic? Stick around to find out. When the game released in late 1995 for the PlayStation and later for the MS-DOS and Sega Saturn, Loaded, which would be developed by Gremlin Interactive, is a top-down, twin-stick style shooter that took a lot of inspiration from arcade classics like Smash TV and Gauntlet, but with a grim, dystopian aesthetic drenched in excessive gore. In some ways, think of Doom that meets Judge Dredd, mixing ultra-violent gameplay with an interesting heavy soundtrack that greatly complements the chaotic nature of each of the levels within the game. The game follows a group of psychotic anti-heroes on a mission to escape a corrupt prison world ruled by a tyrant named Fub. Once you manage to escape, you will progress through many locations across different worlds, from junkyards to deserts, even to space stations, with the goal of eliminating the tyrant once and for all. Each of the levels require you to face varying challenges and puzzles, from flicking switches to finding coloured keycards and blowing apart walls, to reveal hidden rooms or tunnels to acquire weapons and resource upgrades to progress. In a lot of ways, the game did stand out with its over-the-top violence and chaotic gameplay. It would also be one of the first PlayStation games to really show off what the system could do, with detailed 3D visuals, even though most of the gameplay was still in 2D. Back then, some critics compared the game to Doom, which had set the standard for mature themed shooters. But unlike Doom, which was a first-person experience, Loaded's top-down perspective allowed for chaotic run-and-gun gameplay that felt more arcadey and less methodical. It quickly became a cult hit, especially among gamers hungry for violent, edgy content that pushed the boundaries of what consoles could offer. If you're like many of us, more than likely your first experience with Loaded would come in the form of an early demo that was part of the classic Demo 1 CD that often came packaged with the PlayStation console itself. The demo would place you in the role of one of the game's murderous characters, set within one full level of the game's prison section. It was massive in scope and scale, being among the largest demo experiences seen on the disc, yet also very challenging, often requiring multiple tries to master the demo's difficult combat sections to survive long enough to complete the level. It was a very gruesome experience, and if you are familiar with games like Mortal Kombat and Doom, then you would be right at home here. With the success of Loaded, Gremlin Interactive greenlit a sequel with Reloaded, releasing a short time later in 1996. But this time something felt, let's just say, off. Rather than building on what made the first game fun, Reloaded took a sharp turn into the bizarre. The story follows the same group of misfit killers, taking place right after the events of the first game, but the setting is much weirder. The art style is a lot more abstract and the level design is even more confusing. The biggest issue surrounding the game would be in the change of graphics, the unusual level progression requirements and the overall speed of the gameplay, which felt slower than before. While Loaded had a clean industrial cyberpunk look, Reloaded opted for a more surreal biomechanical aesthetic that didn't fit in with the concept seen in the original. The dark and gritty prison environments were replaced with abstract organic structures that were often hard to navigate. The once punchy and satisfying combat felt sluggish due to less responsive controls and frustrating enemy AI. Another issue was the balance of the game. It took longer to defeat enemies, weapons felt less powerful, even with cheats activated, and the levels often dragged on without sufficient variety. Each of the levels gave a briefing section in the beginning on what was expected, but the goals and explanations felt vague. Upon entering most levels, you often felt lost, wandering around aimlessly, unsure of what to do next or where to go. It didn't help that the map structure was even more complicated, as the environments were often hidden from view until you progressed into new sections. But even then, you couldn't tell if you were in a room, a building, or even outside. It overcomplicated the simple structure seen in the original game, which only heightened the player's frustration. Even the soundtrack, while still maintaining an industrial style, failed to evoke the same aggressive energy as its predecessor. Fans who had enjoyed the fast-paced and satisfying combat of Loaded would often be left disappointed. Several factors contributed to Reloaded's failure. First, it came out just a year after the first Loaded game, which meant that there wasn't enough time for real innovation. Instead of evolution, however, it felt like a rushed rehash with a weirder coat of paint. Second, gaming was moving forward very rapidly. By 1996, games like Quake had arrived, pushing the development focus of games into full 3D. Even on PlayStation, more refined shooters and action games with Alien Trilogy and Die Hard Trilogy were raising the bar. Reloaded in many regards felt outdated before it even hit the store shelves. Even to put this into more context, myself personally, I often found myself seeing the game heavily discounted within local game stores only weeks after the game's release, to a point that within only a few months, new copies of the game could be bought for as little as £5, which obviously was a result of the harsh reception it received upon its release. Now, I had plenty of opportunities to purchase the game at those low prices back in the day, but never did, and after finally playing the game all those years later, I can really see why. Is it the worst game I've ever played? Well, not exactly, but it greatly pales in comparison to that of the original entry in the series, and it's easy to see why no more sequels were announced after that. In saying that, the first game wasn't perfect either, as it would become quite repetitive quickly, even though there were only about 15 or so levels. For some, the game was still too long, and would have been better suited to fewer levels, which would become less of a grind. But in the end, Reloaded failed to make the impact of its predecessor, as it did sell poorly and received mixed to negative reviews. Gremlin Interactive would quickly move on to other projects, and the Loaded series was quietly abandoned. Gremlin Interactive was eventually acquired by Infogrames sometime later, effectively ending any chance of Loaded making a comeback. The closest spiritual successor would come in the form of future Cop LAPD, another top-down shooter with similar gameplay mechanics. Meanwhile, twin-stick shooters would later resurface with indie hits like Alien Nation and Ex Mechanica, but Loaded itself faded into obscurity. Loaded is considered a nostalgic favourite for those who grew up playing on the original PlayStation. It perfectly captured the unique atmosphere for a time when over-the-top violence was a novel concept, and every game seemed to be pushing boundaries. While the sequel Reloaded didn't quite live up to the original, the first game is still a brutal, bloody classic that many gamers from the 90s fondly remember. But it does create an interesting discussion, as it was a series that did have some promising aspects that could have presented a lot more to the overall genre, even to that of the PlayStation or later consoles, with its interesting mix of gameplay, characters and overall features. While it wasn't revolutionary to say the least, but for a time it did stand out, and it would be interesting to see what could have been done had the series evolved or moved forward beyond the original two games. So it will be interesting to hear your thoughts of it, so share it in the comments below. But at the same time, while the series saw some brief success in the early months of the PlayStation, it quickly fell into obscurity after the release of Reloaded, which didn't provide anything new, but in fact in many ways felt worse than its predecessor, feeling more rushed over anything else, as the game's landscape in only the few short months after it quickly began to evolve at a rapid pace, with the sheer amount of quality games, series and sequels being released that were bringing way more eyes to Sony's impressive console. And yet, it's not often that we see a game's sequel be seen to be worse than its predecessor. But regardless of what went on behind the development scenes, the Loaded series did inspire the rise of the twin-stick shooter genre to some degree, even if it was only for a short period in time. While it may have been the end of Loaded's short success, that wouldn't be the case for many other popular series to find home on the PlayStation, which you can learn more about in this next video. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.